A discovery that changes the world.
A revelation that the splitting of uranium atoms contained unfathomable amounts of energy.
Promising a time of limitless possibilities.
Maybe it will run our cars, ships, submarines, medicine.
But one haunted by the specter of nuclear holocaust.
Once the Soviets got the bomb, then the race was on.
This is very, very scary information for the Americans.
Where secrets become as crucial as the weapons themselves.
The bomb is the origin of American secrecy.
Hidden stories.
We would have lost a significant portion of the east coast of the United States.
From a world on the brink of global annihilation.
Over 600 million dead from America's weapons alone.
The idea was, if it comes to that, we just want to wipe them off the earth.
Now, decades later, they can finally be told. The atomic age is being declassified. October 3rd, 1995. A presidential committee declassifies a grim report, chronicling some of America's darkest secrets. Buried programs finally brought to light.
Thousands of government-sponsored experiments did take place at hospitals, universities, and military bases around our nation. In too many cases, informed consent was withheld.
In a world haunted by the threat of atomic weapons, the U.S. conducts radiation tests on unsuspecting humans.
In one experiment, scientists injected plutonium into 18 patients without their knowledge, and that was wrong.
The truth went a lot further than medical experiments.
We have declassified thousands of government documents, the files from the Second World War, the Cold War.
The secret documents laid bare the dark truths of the atomic age, when suspicion and paranoia, nuclear anxiety, and anti-communist fervor would justify the kinds of things Clinton's apologizing for now.
So today, by making ourselves accountable for the sins of the past, I hope more than anything else, we are laying the foundation stone for a new era.
The old era began with the atom.
Atomic and subatomic physics was the physical problem of the early decades of the 20th century. It was how you got your Nobel Prize. It was completely where many of the best and the brightest minds were aimed at.
A breakthrough in the late 30s shocks the scientific world. Atomic fission, the splitting of atoms. But it happens in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Discovery of fission in Berlin, Germany, of all places, in December 1938, couldn't have come at a worse moment, with the world on the brink of World War II.
It's a huge new source of energy. Used as a bomb, it would be immensely powerful.
The people in the United States who were most concerned about this in 1939 were the European emigre physicists who wanted to escape from Nazi-occupied Europe.
And they are desperately, desperately afraid of the idea of Nazis with nuclear weapons.
The United States responds with a massive project.
June 1942 was when FDR put his good old check mark on a document, said okay, and approved a crash program to build the bomb, what a few months later would turn into the Manhattan Project.
Entire cities spring up in places like Hanford, Washington, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the first atomic bomb was built. Thousands of people, huge industrial forces, all working together under a shroud of secrecy.
Much of what we associate with secrecy, the way of doing security clearances, the way of doing declassification reviews, Many of those practices come out of the atomic bomb project and were invented for the atomic bomb project. So it's in a very real way that bomb is the origin of American secrecy.
2 years and $2 billion later, the Manhattan Project succeeds.
The atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, on Hiroshima, on August 6, 1945.
America's nuclear secret is out, surprising the entire world, especially the Soviet Union, still picking up the pieces after a devastating war.
It's worth remembering that the Soviet Union loses 27 million citizens, which is a figure unprecedented in the history of our species.
They were supposed to be allies, but the Americans had developed the bomb in secret.
There was a lot of mistrust that started coming out into the open in the second half of the 1940s, and this is what paves the way for the Cold War.
The Soviets see America as a growing threat.
The fear was that a nuclear and atomic monopoly in the hands of the United States would make the world more unstable.
So the Soviets bring their own surprise.
On August 29th, 1949, they demonstrated the detonation of their weapon, and it was a replica, an exact replica of the American bomb.
It's America's turn to be shocked.
People are in the United States in particular are really worried that the Soviet Union is now embarked on this active expansion campaign to, by force, impose communism over the entire globe.
At the turn of the decade, communism is spreading throughout the world.
You have revolutions in China, you have cracking down on countries in Eastern Europe, you have what looks like the active spreading of propaganda and political influence by the Soviet Union.
It looks like the United States has got to stand up to the Russians because the Russians seem to be sweeping the table at that point.
And now, they're building their own bombs. In America, the reaction would be an almost religious determination to contain the spread of communism.
This period really increases the temperature of the politics in the United States. You have people who become very hardline anti-communists, who start believing there are communists everywhere. And the bomb has a big part to play in that. It raises the stakes, and it raises Americans' sense of vulnerability.
It only gets worse when they find out how the Soviets got the bomb. They had spies inside the Manhattan Project itself.
It was early 1950 that the British were able to arrest Klaus Fuchs.
Fuchs was considered brilliant. I mean, he was considered to have a virtually photographic memory, a brilliant theoretical and mathematical physicist. He was so trusted that he was their babysitter when the scientists would have parties. And they didn't have any clue that he was actually giving everything that he looked at to the Soviet Union.
Klaus Fuchs is the first link in a chain leading to one of the biggest spy scandals in American history.
Fuchs identifies a man who served as his go-between with the Russians, named David Greenglass. David Greenglass explains that he was recruited for spying by his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg.
Julius Rosenberg has a small machine shop in the Bronx. He's arrested in July 1950. His wife, Ethel, David Greenglass's sister, a month later. Both are members of the Communist Party. Court filings present them as super spies. They refuse to talk, pleading the fifth instead.
The Rosenbergs deny all involvement. They say this whole thing is fabricated. It's just the anti-communist plot.
They have little chance, especially when Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, testifies against them. Both are found guilty and sentenced to death.
Judge Kaufman handed down the death sentence, he accused the Rosenbergs of having given the atomic bomb to Russia and having caused the 50,000 American deaths in the Korean War. It was a crazy charge, and the Europeans and others reacted that the United States was going insane.
There were multiple attempts to plead for pardoning or clemency or commutation of sentencing. All of this was rejected.
And this becomes a cause célèbre for the left in the United States because the evidence that was presented at the trial was very flimsy.
Both Rosenbergs maintain their innocence to the end.
Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are executed in Sing Sing prison by electric chair.
Debate about their guilt or innocence lasts for decades. Until 1995, when previously classified documents revealed the prosecution knew a lot more than ever came out in court.
During World War II, the United States intercepted a large number of Soviet communications, and they spent an immense amount of time to try and crack these codes.
They were from a spy program codenamed Venona.
We now know we've been able to get access to those decrypted communications, and it's pretty clear that Julius Rosenberg is a spy.
Spies are never referred to by name in Soviet communications.
Julius had a fancy code name because he was an important person. His code name was Antenna.
Ethel was a different story.
Ethel is referred to in the files as Ethel. That's a sign that she isn't a spy. That's a sign that she's the wife of a spy or something like that. It's very minor.
Information from the Venona papers could have convicted Julius, but exonerated Ethel.
Here's the thing, though. The United States does not want the Soviet Union to know that it has cracked its codes, so it will never use that evidence in court.
A government secret deemed so important, Ethel Rosenberg lost her life to ensure it wasn't divulged.
Documents released in 2014 confirm that David Greenglass lied on the stand. He downplayed Ethel's role initially, and then later accuses her of having transcribed the documents and been involved in a much more fundamental way.
Ethel Rosenberg was framed by her own brother.
He later admitted to perjuring himself, and the reason he did this was because if he got both Julius and Ethel implicated, they would let his wife, Ruth, off the hook.
David got off with a much lighter sentence, while Ruth was never charged at all.
And there's still an open question today about what's the justice in executing them. They were spying for an ally. Klaus Fuchs only got 14 years in prison, and he didn't serve all of them.
The secrecy surrounding the Rosenbergs still shadows their case today.
The fact that the United States did not and could not give the really compelling evidence on the Rosenbergs meant that people could kind of look at it and see what they wanted to see. And that it further drove this polarizing politics of the period. It's seen as a very dark moment in the Cold War.
By the time Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are executed in June 1953, there's no line that wouldn't be crossed in the name of containing communism. In a country that's convinced it's better dead than red.
It wasn't just paranoia. The Soviets were a threat, but it was clearly an exaggerated threat.
Even the suggestion of communist activity is enough to provoke a brutal response.
You also get the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who alleges that there are innumerable communists embedded in the United States government.
All that Senator McCarthy has been trying to do is expose the communists who have infiltrated the Department of the Army, a very small percentage.
In the United States, you see the evolution of this fear of penetration in the American public, which really paves the way for McCarthyism.
And it's just a very dangerous, ugly time in American politics.
No one seems to know who to trust, so they trust no one.
The Americans become obsessed with secrecy in a way we'd never been before.
We ask every citizen to immediately report any information regarding espionage, sabotage, or un-American activities.
Becomes an obsession for J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, and the congressional investigators. They begin to question the loyalty of people like Robert Oppenheimer.
J. Robert Oppenheimer, the man who led the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos.
J. Robert Oppenheimer was an American theoretical physicist and was considered extremely brilliant from a very young age.
With the war over, the future of the American nuclear program is up for debate. Conflicts arise between Oppenheimer and a former friend and colleague, one of the world's leading physicists, Edward Teller.
Teller became a major advocate for building not just nuclear weapons, but thermonuclear weapons. This is a weapon that was imagined as being easily 1,000 times more powerful.
Oppenheimer isn't convinced. And he wasn't alone.
Some of the scientists who opposed it, most importantly, the General Advisory Committee to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, they unanimously voted against building the hydrogen bomb. Several of its members said this is a weapon that's too large for any military target. It would constitute a weapon of genocide. It would be evil.
Teller becomes the H-bomb's most outspoken champion.
He felt that if the Soviet Union especially got the atomic bomb, then the proper response was to get the hydrogen bomb in the United States, that you always had to stay one step ahead. Eventually came to see anybody who stood in the way of progress in nuclear weapons development as potentially being traitorous.
Teller teams up with Lewis Strauss, powerful chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, and another aggressive supporter of the H-bomb.
Strauss was particularly bitter toward Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer had no respect for Strauss. Oppenheimer even ridiculed him.
Teller and Strauss decide that Oppenheimer can no longer be trusted with America's nuclear secrets.
This is a conspiracy. There is an active conspiracy between people like Strauss, Teller, several other scientists as well.
They get a chance to act when a letter reaches President Eisenhower accusing Oppenheimer of being a Soviet agent.
Oppenheimer's past is starting to become a major liability. In the 1930s, he became very active in sort of far-left communist causes.
We don't know for sure if Oppenheimer himself was in the Communist Party, but everybody around him, including his wife, his brother's wife, all of his graduate students, they were all in the Communist Party.
Eisenhower revokes his security clearance. In response, Oppenheimer demands a hearing.
The hearing is not supposed to be a trial, but it plays out a lot like a trial. It's very adversarial. It turns out to be a really awful experience for Oppenheimer. Every decision he made, every failure he had in his life, the fact that he had mistresses and affairs, the fact that he had lied to security officers, all of this comes out.
Teller is one of the last to testify.
Teller says that he would rather see somebody else in that position, and he basically says he doesn't trust Oppenheimer.
After 19 days, the commission announces its decision.
Though they do say that they don't have any evidence that he was a spy, and they don't really have any evidence that he was disloyal. What they eventually conclude was he's unreliable at times.
His clearance revoked. Oppenheimer is forced into scientific exile. He lives out his life a broken man. But it turns out the deck was stacked against Oppenheimer. A series of crucial declassifications reveal what really happened. His defense team had their hands tied from the start. Without the necessary security clearance, they couldn't even review many of the charges against him. They were removed from the room when the prosecution presented classified evidence. They were also being wiretapped. May 2009, notebooks made with special access to KGB archives are released, confirming that Oppenheimer was never involved in Soviet espionage.
It wasn't until 2014 or so that the Department of Energy re-looked at all of these hearings and decided what could be released, and the answer is everything can be released at this point.
The October 2014 declassification was the biggest of all. 19 volumes of transcripts from the hearing, much of which would have supported Oppenheimer's public claims of innocence.
Oppenheimer was shattered by the whole experience of the hearing and its consequences. He ended up sort of retiring to an island in the Caribbean and essentially drinking himself to death.
For many, he is another example of an innocent victim of the Red Scare.
He became really a martyr. He became a symbol of a muzzle on people, a sort of punishment for their political positions.
As anti-communist politics continue to dominate America, the country embraces Teller's vision of its nuclear future. The device he first called the Super, the H-bomb. Beginning in 1952, the U.S. films dozens of thermonuclear tests, studying the frightening power of the H-bomb. These images were only recently declassified. America has built the most destructive weapon the world has ever seen. Is it prepared to use it? In the 1950s, the U.S. nuclear arsenal expands at an astonishing rate. From 50 weapons at the start of the decade to 12,000 at the end. The official policy is that we have them so that we don't have to use them. But in 2015, a declassified battle plan shows that it wasn't all defensive posturing. Here's how America planned to fight World War III.
You just can't leave these weapons around. You have to plan for their use. And there was, at the end of the Eisenhower and the beginning of the Kennedy administrations, the creation of real nuclear war plans. These war plans are highly secret.
The Strategic Air Command Atomic Weapons Requirements Study for 1959 is the most complete U.S. battle plan ever declassified.
The most frightening thing is the assumption that any war between the United States and Russia is going to go nuclear almost immediately.
SAC's plan? Respond with nukes, lots of them.
The American policy was to shoot off our entire arsenal at once, not a graduated, step-by-step escalation, but to shoot it all off at once.
The 800-page battle plan breaks down into two types of targets: military installations.
You do strategic bombing to destroy the enemy's ability to wage war. And this means you hit their military bases and their airfields and things like that.
And what the report euphemistically calls urban industrial complexes.
But it also means it's destroying their entire industrial infrastructure as well. And that means destroying cities.
Targets include major population centers spread across China, the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe, with Moscow at the top of the list. Over 1,000 in all.
There's probably going to be a lot of fallout that will go onto your allies as well. The idea was you could destroy the entire Soviet Union within 3 to 10 hours or so. And so the hope was maybe you'd lose Europe, but the United States would survive.
The battle plan assumes the civilian population will be hit hard to destroy the enemy's will to fight.
The U.S. government has not liked to acknowledge that many of its targeting policies would have huge civilian casualties. It's not typically the policy of the government to say we target civilians directly. That's sort of like a war crime.
As the plan gets updated, it still includes massive collateral damage.
The internal government estimates for how many Soviet citizens would die in this kind of thing are hundreds of millions. It's a huge number.
Over 600 million dead from America's weapons alone. That doesn't even account for any Soviet retaliation.
The cold, brutal calculations that will obliterate huge parts of the planet. Were we really ready to push the button? It's all there in any of that era's battle plans. America, leader of the free world, is prepared to destroy it.
The idea was, if it comes to that, we just want to wipe them off the earth and be done with it. And we'll have to deal with that, the consequences of that.
If North America is ever attacked by a hostile force with manned bombers, it would, as you have just seen, be subjected to a continuous, intensively devastating attack from as far out as possible, with every type of lethal weapon in our air defense arsenal.
If there is a third world war, there won't be winners and losers in the traditional sense. And most likely, nobody left for either side to negotiate with. Mutually assured destruction becomes the atomic age's most infamous doctrine. One the world hopes will never be put into action. Many scientists still think that there might be more peaceful possibilities for the atomic age.
From the beginning, many of the scientists had a dream that nuclear power would be used for beneficial purposes, for life-affirming purposes, not just for destructive purposes.
A lot of the scientists who worked on this saw it as being potentially extremely useful for medicine, for research, for even changing food production. They were hoping, almost hoping against hope, that this wouldn't just be used for exterminating cities.
In December 1946, the first successful treatment of a patient with thyroid cancer using a radioisotope is reported in medical journals. Isotopes are created from nuclear reactions.
Capturing the atom's probing power, science has found a powerful new tool to study and defeat sickness and make a healthier, happier life for the benefit of all mankind.
Many other atomic plans border on science fiction.
Some of these ideas are relatively modest. Some of them are completely, in retrospect, outlandish.
We were going to reroute rivers. We were going to change mountain ranges. We were going to change the surface of the Earth. We even had plans to change the direction of hurricanes by dropping hydrogen bombs alongside the eye of the hurricane.
Some of the wildest ideas come close to being approved, like an artificial harbor in Alaska to be excavated with 5 detonations.
Project Orion would use thermonuclear weapons to accelerate a spaceship.
The technology needed to build a nuclear rocket is well advanced. Nuclear rocket propulsion will expand our ability to explore space.
In the beginning, the promises for atomic science were out of this world. But the reality quickly crashes back to Earth.
On the whole, it isn't the thing where everybody has, a nuclear pill that they take and it cures them of all their diseases. But these things are what happen when you get very creative people and say, find a use for this that isn't just killing people.
But the real spending and progress on nuclear technology continues to be powered by the military, often in secret.
Even the atom may release its giant strength for aircraft. The Atomic Energy Commission, the Air Force, and General Electric are already cooperating on an atomic power plant for an aircraft to be built by Convair.
the Air Force commissions a project to build the world's first nuclear-powered plane. Details of the propulsion system are classified. September 1955, a specially adapted Convair XB-36H bomber rolls out for its first flight. With a fully functioning nuclear reactor on board. It's the first of 47 test flights. Although active, the reactor never provides power to the engines. In 1961, the project is scrapped for good. But there were still high hopes for nuclear propulsion systems. They just weren't in the sky.
This is the story of the Nautilus, the world's first atomic-powered submarine, and the world's first use of nuclear fission for propulsion.
In June 1952, President Truman characterizes Nautilus as a breakthrough event for nuclear science.
This ship will be something new in the world. The heat in her boilers will be created by the same force that heats the sun.
Converting a fission reaction into propulsion marked a milestone in atomic science. The Nautilus, in theory, could cruise around the world without refueling. Powered by a lump of uranium the size of a golf ball. The U.S. publicly touts it as the most advanced sub of its day. But the details of its real breakthrough, nuclear-powered propulsion, are highly classified, then and now.
On April 25, 1958, the Nautilus departed her home port of New London, Connecticut. Destination, the Pacific, by way of the Panama Canal.
It begins a mission codenamed Operation Sunshine. In late July, it reaches Hawaii and the naval base at Pearl Harbor. What happens next is so top secret, it's known to only the ship's crew, a few high-ranking Navy officials, and the president. Officially, Nautilus will sail south first, to the equator, then on to Panama. Instead, she submerges and heads north on a 3-week journey.
Unseen, beneath the sea, the Nautilus journeyed north to the edge of the Arctic ice pack, then under. The voyage to the North Pole was underway.
The Nautilus is attempting to become the first vessel to sail under the North Pole. The proposed route has them traveling up the Bering Sea, under the pole, and emerging at Greenland.
All hands on the Nautilus knew their destination and the perilous route they were to follow in reaching it. Above, a continent of ice covering the Arctic Sea, and ahead, 1,800 miles of cold, watery darkness.
Running blind in the cold, dark depths, the Nautilus clears a vast, uncharted underwater mountain range, reaches deep water again, and closes in on the top of the world.
All hands, this is the captain speaking. In a few moments, Nautilus will realize a goal long sought by those who have sailed the seas, the attaining of the North Pole. 8, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1, mark. For the USA and the U.S. Navy, the North Pole.
36 hours later, the sub surfaces, and America quickly tells the world about Operation Sunshine. The U.S. trumpets it as a scientific miracle.
Nautilus had made history. The men of the Nautilus had blazed a trail under the Arctic pack, which reduced the distance from the Orient to Europe by almost half.
But the Soviet Union gets a very different message. America has put a submarine on its doorstep. A sub that may soon carry nuclear missiles.
At once a formidable fighting ship and a forerunner of commercial atomic power, the Nautilus heralds a new era of the atomic age.
The need to demonstrate the ability to strike the enemy will become a hallmark of the Cold War. April 1962. John Kennedy's popularity hits an all-time high, with many citing his firm hand with the Soviets. That October, he'll face the ultimate test of the atomic age.
Khrushchev decided he could both protect Cuba and restore some of the imbalance in nuclear capabilities if he puts nuclear weapons into Cuba.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet ships carrying nukes approach the island, just 100 miles off the Florida coast.
It was a reckless, foolhardy, crazy thing to do.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
As the world watches and waits, even the American president is unaware of the two greatest dangers he's facing. Two secrets that won't be revealed for decades. Two stories of how close the world really came to all-out nuclear war. October 1962. Soviet ships carrying missiles approach Cuba. U.S. forces are at DEFCON 2, the highest state of alert ever. The next step, DEFCON 1, a shooting war.
Kennedy declares a blockade, which is also an act of war, but he calls it a quarantine in order to make it seem a little more palatable.
More than 230 American warships spread out along the sea lanes into Cuba, awaiting the Soviet response. It will become one of the most famous moments of the Cold War. But it wasn't until 1992 that we found out the official version wasn't the whole story.
The Soviet ships are heading toward the quarantine line. A sub accompanying some of those ships is spotted by the American cruisers and destroyers.
The American ships start dropping special depth charges about the size of grenades.
The Soviets think that the United States is trying to sink them, that this is the beginning of the war. Why else would we be attacking a military vessel? They didn't realize that our protocol for a destroyer to make a subsurface is to drop sort of mock depth charges on it. Not trying to kill it, but to signal to it in a very rough way that they should surface.
We now know that was almost a fatal mistake.
The Americans had no idea that they had nuclear weapons on board.
Or that the sub's 3 senior officers had the authority to launch those nukes. But only if the decision was unanimous.
The Soviet commander gives the order to launch the nuclear torpedo.
One of the other high-ranking officers says, okay, that sounds good. And then the last high-ranking officer, a guy named Arkhipov, says, no, we're not going to do that. I will not approve of that. That's how close it comes. One vote, one person.
Another of the Cold War's biggest what-ifs.
Had that happened, they would have taken out the U.S. fleet. The U.S. would have definitely taken out Cuba, but very likely would have taken out the Soviet Union.
That wasn't the only near miss we didn't know about. Aerial reconnaissance had brought back evidence of missile site preparation in Cuba. If operational, they could strike almost anywhere in the United States. In response, American military leaders urged Kennedy to authorize an attack on mainland Cuba.
The military leaders want to bomb the missile sites and invade and overthrow the Cuban government. Kennedy resists.
In the days that follow, an American U-2 spy plane is shot down, and U.S. troops are ready for invasion. After a 13-day standoff, Kennedy and Khrushchev strike a deal. It's over. The Soviets pack up their nukes and go home. History records it as President Kennedy's finest hour. The day he stood up to the Soviets, kept nukes out of Cuba, and saved the world. But as so often in the atomic age, declassified secrets tell a very different story.
The biggest myth of the Cuban Missile Crisis that was common for decades and decades is that the United States stopped the Soviet Union from putting nuclear weapons on Cuba. It was not until the 1990s that we found out that we had not stopped them, that there were already nuclear weapons on the island.
Smaller, short-range tactical nuclear missiles, battlefield nukes.
There were several operational missiles already ready to go that would have been used if the United States had attempted a military invasion of Cuba.
McNamara, when he heard that, he turned white.
Because as Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara knows how close America came to invading Cuba.
But if we had actually done that, we would have certainly gotten into at least a limited nuclear war, and that easily could have sped out of control into a much larger nuclear war.
Those 13 days in October brought us even closer than we ever thought to nuclear war. What we didn't know almost killed us.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a great example of how a hair-trigger decision by a submarine captain or a battery defense unit on the island of Cuba could have precipitated a full-out conflict, potentially with a nuclear exchange, which, thank God, never happened.
When you're always prepared for a nuclear attack, it means you're always on the brink of World War III. And all it takes is one mistake for it to start. January 24th, 1961. 275 miles south of Washington, in Fayette, North Carolina, a U.S. Air Force B-52 declares an emergency. It carries 2 4-megaton thermonuclear bombs, H-bombs. 260 times the explosive force of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The plane is part of an operation codenamed Chrome Dome.
This, our country and all its people, could be in danger of nuclear attack. In minutes by enemy missiles. In hours by enemy aircraft. To avoid surprise disaster, some of our aircraft must always be in the sky or on the alert, carrying nuclear weapons.
It's one of up to 12 B-52s carrying nuclear payloads that are in the air at all times, ready for the order to strike the Soviet Union.
They would fly up to the borders of the Soviet Union and turn around and come back.
The plan works to keep the Soviets on edge.
But there's a certain number of hours you can fly a bomber before you're going to expect it to crash.
Crashed bombers with nuclear payloads. Lost nukes. It happens often enough, there's a name for it.
The phrase broken arrow has to do with a nuclear weapon accident. To be a broken arrow, it has to, it's a pretty serious accident.
January 17th, 1966. Palomares, Spain, a small fishing village and beach town on the Mediterranean coast. An American B-52 carrying 4 H-bombs collides with a tanker at 29,000 feet and breaks up in midair.
Strategic Air Command bomber filled with bombs and dropped the weapons, some which landed on land and one that went into the Mediterranean.
The official line is that a plane has crashed and spread hazardous material on the ground. In fact, as the press finds out, a nuclear weapon is missing somewhere in the Mediterranean.
Cruisers and destroyers with sonar equipment have been trying to locate the lost bomb and also screening the approaches against enemy spies.
It takes 2 months just to find the sunken weapon. A mini-sub eventually hauls it to the surface. It was intact. But 2 of the other 3 bombs actually exploded. They became accidental dirty bombs, spreading traces of toxic plutonium dust for miles. American troops removed truckloads of contaminated dirt for months.
And this still goes on. I mean, I think we're still bringing back soil from Spain that is laden with plutonium. That's a serious health hazard.
At least all 4 bombs were recovered. Some broken arrows are never found.
There was another incident in 1968 in Fuel Greenland, which again, nuclear bombs were dropped.
A crippled B-52 patrolling near the Arctic Circle is attempting an emergency landing. The crew of 7 bails out. 1 dies. The plane crashes onto the sea ice. There's no nuclear detonation, but once again, the impact, conventional explosion, and resulting fire create the effect of a dirty bomb, spreading radioactive material for miles. Cleanup crews battle a frozen wasteland. Average temperature, -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews work around the clock to remove 250,000 cubic feet of contaminated ice and snow before it melts into the sea. The military claims all 4 nukes are recovered at the crash site. But a 2008 report alleges that one of the bombs still lies on the sea floor. Closer to home, in January 1961, in North Carolina, a B-52 attempting an emergency landing never makes it back to base.
This bomber sort of disintegrates into the air. It sort of breaks apart very violently, and these 2 weapons are sort of flung out of the bomber bay.
Pieces of the bomber rain down onto the small farming town of Faro. 1 bomb floats to Earth after its parachute deploys. The other crashes into a field. The Pentagon claims neither weapon was ever in danger of exploding. But a 2013 Freedom of Information request reveals that one of the weapons had virtually completed the arming sequence.
This bomb actually attempted to arm itself and fire. It went through just a very set of freak accidents, and fortunately didn't.
1 switch like this one out of 4 prevents a nuclear disaster.
If that other small switch didn't hold, then that nuclear bomb would have detonated. We would have lost a significant portion of the east coast of the United States.
When its chute doesn't open, the second bomb slams into the ground, sinking more than 150 feet deep. It takes 3 days of frantic digging to find it.
They found that its switch, it was armed. So if that one switch had been in the other bomb at that time, the bomb would have completely legitimately thought that it was ready to explode.
The military removes the nuclear fuel at the bomb's core. But the uranium trigger is never located. A nuclear detonator is still buried in that North Carolina field. In 1968, Operation Chrome Dome, keeping nukes in the air 24/7, is abandoned. To date, the U.S. military admits to 32 broken arrows. Information about 21 has been declassified. 11 remain top secret. November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. Many hope 5 decades of paranoia and suspicion crumble with it.
There was great joy and enthusiasm that perhaps the Cold War would be over, the Russians weren't coming, which had been a rationale all along through the decades.
With the fall of the Soviet Union, the atomic age's hidden stories are finally being declassified. And Americans are finding out what we were willing to do to fight the Cold War and protect our secrets.
In the 1990s, after the Cold War ended, many Americans had a sort of reckoning with what had happened. How did we get to this state of almost killing ourselves off? How did we get to the state of having tens of thousands of nuclear weapons? How did we get into a place of having all these secrets about doing things that seem not just anti-American, but unethical by any standard?
The obsession with secrecy, born with the bomb, is a legacy of the atomic age. America still keeps its secrets. Which ones are we keeping now?
I saw this as an indispensable part of our effort to restore the confidence of the American people in the integrity of their government. That at the very least, they could trust the United States government to tell the truth and to do the right things.